Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to tell you about a project which I devised as a post-retirement unpaid research scholar at South Bank University, where I was working for about 10 years in the Families and Social Capital Group for 5 years, and then before that in the Local Economy and Policy Unit. It's about sheltered housing, aka retirement housing, which is now the preferred term. But it's also very much about some of the themes that we've been talking about all day and which you've been talking about earlier in this series. And I'm not going to focus on loneliness qua feelings so much as the process of making friends, how much people do that through formal activities like clubs and classes and choirs and that kind of thing, and how much people do it through informal activities and chatting. I'm going to talk about how people make friends, and I'm going to talk about how having friends or not really makes an enormous difference in older age to some practical considerations. So basically, this is a bit more of a social capital approach than some of the other presentations you may have had, but I hope it's going to be useful anyway. I should first of all give credit to my collaborator, George Whirlidge of Hanover Housing Association, who facilitated a lot of the field work with his bosses, opened doors for me to research subjects in the form of the tenants and the managers. But not all of it is about Hanover. I began with focus groups on 16 different estates, of which 8 were Hanover estates, and 5 were managed by other housing associations. Actually, it was more like 7, because one of the Hanover estates really didn't want to play, so I ended up interviewing 2 people by telephone, which took half an hour each and was extremely interesting, and revealed reasons why a focus group couldn't happen on that particular estate. There were 2 leasehold estates where people are effectively owner-occupiers. They're a bit different. They tend to be occupied by higher income people who have different interests and different ways of going about things. There was one very large mixed tenure estate, including some extra care residents, rather like the retirement villages, which have featured a lot in the literature on sheltered housing, aka retirement housing. And that seemed to work very well. This is a theme I'll come back to, that the mixed tenure estates unite people with managerial and professional experience who are used to kind of organising and leading things and sticking up for themselves, with people who perhaps don't have all those sort of experiences and are a bit more passive about the way they go about things. The second stage of the work was a postal survey of tenants on the 8 Hanover estates with 120 respondents. And the third was a web-based survey of the Hanover estate managers. Whereas the first 2 stages were only in southeast England, the web-based survey of managers of housing estates was all over the country, because Hanover have properties right from the Scottish borders down to the south coast. And this was supported by a little bit of analysis from ELSA to show whether residents in this kind of housing are more or less lonely than the population of over 60s at large. One would like to think that this housing setting makes people less lonely, that it's friendly, neighbourly, etc. Unfortunately, it turned out that wasn't quite the case, but we'll come to that in a moment. And there was also a lengthy literature review, which I think is very relevant to you because it covers a lot of the interventions to address loneliness, the lack of friendships, the lack of adequate networks, which you've been talking about in the projects that we discussed earlier this morning. So as I said, this is partly a social capital approach. Beginning at the bottom, we have various ways in which people make friends originally. They have a former social circle, work, leisure, church, mosque, synagogue, whatever, voluntary work. And then they have activities outside the estate, like clubs, groups, and so forth. And these may be things from their current lives or from their previous lives. These will lead to current friendships, a sort of bank of current friendships from which they derive various kinds of support. And these are fed, you hope, by social activities on the estate, which may be informal contacts with neighbours in corridors, the laundrette and so on, or maybe actual clubs, classes, exercise sessions, musical activities and things like that. And the inevitable stock in trade of sheltered housing, which sounds to me extraordinarily boring, and I hope I never have to suffer it, which is coffee mornings and bingo. And one of my themes is, let's get something more interesting going on than that. But if it works, these state social activities provide a sense of community within the estate, which then feeds back into more activities, creates a sort of virtuous circle whereby friendships grow, feed that sense of community, and in good cases, you get then a sense of identity which is sufficient to make collective self-representation by the community to management. Sometimes this takes the form of, will you, the manager, publicise our coffee morning, get us an exercise trainer, get us more equipment for our common rooms so we can show films and this kind of thing. Great. In one leasehold estate, it led to a great argument about who the management company was, and that was very influential, and some people got themselves onto various national study groups and working parties about improvement of this kind of housing. All very good. The current friendships also lead to support, practical and emotional, along with the family. Or so we hope. I mean, we all know that families don't always work. Friendships don't always work either. I mean, they may remain on the level of cordiality rather than solidarity, but we hope they lead to practical help. And I think people can be left with one rather than the other. I mean, the example was given earlier today of this guy called Alf, who lived with his son and his grandsons, had lots of support in a practical sense, got looked after, got cooked for, presumably, etc., but still felt lonely. So that situation can emerge where the family provides support, but not cultural or emotional interests or intimacy. Conversely, you might have loads of people you can go to the cinema with, or you might have a nice choir you can participate in once a week. But will those people help do your laundry, let alone help give you a bath when you come out of hospital? So that's the kind of problem people face. Then we have a slide about the needs for support. This is where I have to peer through my glasses, I'm afraid, being a bit too old for this kind of thing. People have a need, first of all, for companionship, going out, meeting people, exercise, mental stimulus, very important in keeping up your memory skills and all that, and obviously for conversation. And this is one recruiting ground for closer friendship. If you have companions, you can make friends. If you don't have companions, if you don't see people, you're not going to make new friends. The source for this may be the formal activities listed in the green box. There are also obviously informal activities, neighbours, friendship networks built up throughout life and so forth, as I was talking about earlier. People have a need for practical help, shopping, help with changing light bulbs. There was one residents association leader in one of my focus groups who was the tallest guy in the community. He was 6'4" or something, and he was the expert light bulb changer for all the flats. There was another guy who'd been a computer technician, and he fixed the computers. There was another guy who'd been a TV technician, and he fixed the TV sets when people went onto the digital signal, which some of them found problematic. So you get this kind of practical help developing within the community, you hope. There are other schemes where not a lot of that goes on. People need help in sickness or emergency. Our survey talked a lot about that. They also need lifts and help getting out. There was one scheme manager who actually walked someone to the nearby village to introduce her to a community centre activity and show her the way and, give her confidence in getting there. That obviously is a very important, useful kind of thing. There was another guy who was trying to keep up with his Freemasons lodge, and he said, if it wasn't for other people giving me lifts last winter, I would never have kept that up. And me, early 60s, stuck in a sheltered housing scheme. I love that group. I really want to keep up with it. So this is where lifts are really important. Then people have a need for emotional support. They need confidants. And when I was writing about this, somebody came up with literature that said, well, you know, everyone needs confidants. Do the formal activities and so forth provide that? Maybe not, but they provide a recruiting ground. And, you know, despite what Elsa may tell you, and other surveys may tell you about friendship networks somehow survive into older age, there is a point where people begin to die. If you're 90, the chances are that you've outlived quite a lot of your friends. So what do you do then? You need to replace those confidants, so you need some recruiting grounds from the lilac circle if it survived, and particularly from the green circle if it can be provided in your housing setting or your local community centre. Now, coming to the yellow box, one of the issues is how many people actually have children within reach. A lot don't. I'll come to this point later on, but you know, we are seeing a society in which families are dispersed, migration is widespread, kids go away to university, don't come back to their hometown, loads of people whose parents or siblings or nephews are thousands of miles away. So what do they do when they're 85 and they need someone to do their shopping, let alone help change their socks? This really becomes a problem. I once figured out from various fertility tables and census data that when we get to the 2020s, round about 2 in 5 of the women passing the age of 60, 2 in 5, 40%, will not have had any children. So this could become a serious problem for the next generation of elders. There are various threats. When I was listening to the presentation this morning, I made some notes about why people become lonely. I probably should have had a slide about this. First of all, they may have inadequate networks. Secondly, they may have a rupture in their networks. For example, if your partner dies and you no longer see the people that you saw with your partner. Or if you move house to be in a sheltered housing scheme, you think, well, yeah, I want to move out of London. London is terrible in traffic and polluted. Let's go to the seaside. Well, there's nobody at the seaside that I know. I met a lady who said, I have to make friends through my dog because, you know, here I am stuck on the Essex coast and there's nobody to talk to except these old ladies who talk about their health all the time. I'm 64, I don't need that, you know. So people have ruptures in their networks. They may have a lack of friendship skills. I was very attracted to a paper by Nan Stevens in Aging in Society a while back, which was about the need to sometimes teach people how to make friends. They may have always made friends through their partner or through some network that they now don't have contact with. And then they're lost after bereavement or a move, and they think, where do I start? And so, you know, they did actually devise a program to show people ways of making friends. And it was taken up apparently by about 200 agencies in the Netherlands, which sounds very useful. I need to investigate that further. Then you have cultural barriers. I mean, in the focus groups, people came up with things like, I don't understand how my neighbours speak, and they don't understand me. There's a lady from such and such country, and she can't understand us. Or there's a lady who speaks with a strong Irish accent, and I can't understand what she says. And I think as people's hearing fades a bit, I mean, mine's fading already, and I'm sure if I still had conferences in French or stuff, I'd be lost. But, you know, you multiply that problem by 20 people living in a housing scheme from culturally diverse backgrounds, and you've got an issue, particularly if some of them weren't used to those kind of accents in their younger days. You also have issues, really big issues, about sensory impairment and, above all, wheelchair use and mobility problems. People may have a common room downstairs. Will someone push their wheelchair so they can get to take part in the activity? Sometimes it might be the estate manager who'll do it. Sometimes the estate manager will say, the employer's insurance doesn't permit me to do this. Sometimes people will say, well, the estate manager's only here like 3 days a week, and these activities happen at the weekend or in the evenings, so what do we do then? And I came across one lovely lady who had Parkinson's disease, and she was really, really worried about getting worse and worse. And she said, what am I going to do when I'm confined to a wheelchair? Because Age UK, bless them, I'm not criticising this, but it's a fact, as she said, anyway. She said they charge money per hour for someone to come and help you do this kind of thing, like pushing a wheelchair. And her friend said, oh, I'll help you. But the friend was smaller than me and a bit older than me. And you think, well, how long is she really going to have the strength to do that? And then I came across another woman in another scheme whose husband had got the most beautiful, expensive, super tech electric wheelchair so he could go out on the street. Could she get it into the lift? You know, I mean, these big fancy wheelchairs are actually very difficult to maneuver. And if it's a small woman maneuvering a very large man, her husband, she's got problems. So you have all these sort of barriers. And there was another lady who said, well, they used to distribute the program on audio tape for blind people. Now they don't do it anymore. The staff don't have time or something. So that was a problem for her. You know, she felt she didn't know what was going on in this big housing scheme with lots of activities because she needed someone to read her the program. So we have all these reasons why people's networks may be ruptured or difficult to access. And going back to the central box, I think a very big problem, again, is if people's network is too old or too frail. It's really important for people to make younger contacts. It may be right down the bottom of the age scale, like North London Cares are trying to achieve, for example, or this project you heard about earlier in this series, Magic Me. It sounds great. But it's also the younger old helping the older old. I mean, I've been to day centres in Camden. Is there somebody from Camden here? No, she was on the list, but maybe she didn't come. There's a couple of day centres in Camden where they have a sort of all-purpose, all-singing, all-dancing, they really do sing and dance, seniors club for the over 60s from the community. And these are next door to or part of a sheltered housing scheme. So the lively people who've only just retired or are still about to retire come and do things, organise art clubs, music, all sorts of interesting things, drama, cooking, all sorts of stuff. The very elderly can join in. It's all kind of done, it's there. They can join in, even if they're not feeling very well that day or not able to organise things anymore. It's there for them, which is great. And they help people with their mobility issues as well, which is also great. You also have an issue about the age mix in sheltered housing schemes. I mean, if there's a good age mix, if you've got 89-year-olds mixed with 68-year-olds, then that works well. If, on the other hand, all the community moved in shortly after retirement age at the same time, and they all age together, and they're replaced by very frail people as the stock of social housing diminishes and the places are taken up by those most in need, who are often the oldest and the most frail, then you might end up with someone like this place on the Essex coast. I don't know how this one woman that I spoke to got into it, but anyway, she was like the only really young one, younger than me that is, in a scheme that was dominated by very elderly, very frail people, and she felt really isolated. So where do we go next? Yeah, as I said, the ELSA data, I looked at one wave where they did a kind of binary question, have you felt lonely much of the last week? There were more people in retirement housing that said this than people in ordinary housing. But when I did a logistic regression to sort this out, you know, was this because of the kind of people they were, or was it because of the housing setting? No, it's not because of the housing setting. It's because a lot of them are bereaved, they're widowed, they have really serious health problems, they have mobility problems. And there's also quite a lot of low-income people who say that they're under financial strain. All of those factors contribute to cut people off from social networks and make them have less energy to keep up the friendship networks that they might have had. So they are lonely. So the challenge for retirement housing managers is basically to compensate for that. And in the postal survey, we asked people, does living in retirement housing make people to make friends? Do you have more friends now than you did 2 years before you moved in? And just over half said they had the same number of friends then now as they do then. 28% had fewer friends than 2 years before moving into the estate. And out of the 11 respondents in their 90s, not a real sample, I know, but you know, it's indicative, 5 had fewer friends now. But I think the significant thing in a qualitative sense is that nobody over 90 wanted more social contacts. compared to 47% of those under 70 who said they wanted more social contact. So the desire for social contact seems to fade away a bit as people get very elderly. They like to stay in their flats, just think about things, reminisce, wait for their relatives to visit if they have any nearby to visit, and so on. And even if the estate managers try to get them involved in things, they have a job dragging these people out of their flats and getting them to participate in whatever. In fact, the organising of events and activities was mainly done by the middle-age group, the 65 to 75. Not so much the under 65s insofar as they're represented. They're represented a little bit in this kind of housing, because some of them are still working, and if they're not still working, they're engaged in outside activities, like the example I gave of the Freemasons' Lodge, and they don't mix so much with the older ones. Okay. Point here is childless people are very vulnerable to lack of emergency support. We asked people, would you say the friend whom you most rely on in difficult times is a relative or partner, or is it a non-relative, or would it be a paid carer, or would it be no one? And when people ticked, more than half of them did say a relative or partner, but relatively few of those were partners. They were mainly children or grandchildren or occasionally nieces and nephews. In their 60s, less than half rely on relatives. By their 90s, almost everyone relies on relatives. This is the attrition of effective networks. Not just networks, but effective networks. Networks of people who are strong enough, healthy enough, mobile enough to come and do something for you if you're really ill. And this meant that amongst the childless people, who were over a fifth of the sample, only 37% had a relative that they could rely on at difficult times, compared to more than 2/3 of those who did have at least one living child. And the further away the children lived, the more of a problem that was. However, what is interesting, and I think this is a positive thing about the sheltered housing setting, is that of those people who relied on non-relatives, it was a neighbour for 1 in 3. It was a neighbour. So neighbours are quite neighbourly in this kind of setup, and particularly if there's a mixed age range and the younger ones can help the older ones. Excuse me, I must take some water. The issue about relatives, and in particular children and grandchildren, is much more of a problem for men. 47% of men rely on a non-relative, but less than a quarter of the women. So this means that as their friends die or move away, men are going to become more vulnerable than women to having no one to rely on in emergencies. Then we asked in the postal survey of 120 tenants, again this was the Hanover bit, who would buy food for you or help with laundry if you were ill? Over 2/3 said relatives, 28% said neighbours, 26% said friends outside the estate, and the rest it was a care worker or they didn't know. And again, almost 80% of those with children said a relative would help, compared to only 40% of childless people. And here you get the proximity of the children as being a factor as well. Some people had children, but they lived miles and miles away. Not very useful. And this is where I think the lifetime development of social capital through the various networks people have seems to count. It was interesting that if people had developed social capital in the activities that they said they did before they came into retirement housing, through either group leisure or particularly voluntary work activities, if they'd been active in a political party or a trade union, or they'd held some official position like being a councillor or a school governor, or they've been active in some charitable work, that just about doubled the chances of getting help from non-relatives, including, surprisingly, current neighbours. So it's not just about these are friends from your previous life that you helped who will now help you. It's about I have developed the skills, the know-how, the sociability, the approach to people that helps me make friends in my new life in sheltered housing. And this, I think, is very important. Okay, we come now to the question of whether organised groups, organised activities like coffee mornings, bingo, choirs, Robert Putnam's favourite, all that kind of thing actually helps people make friends. And here, you know, the literature is actually quite divided. Some of the literature says, well, it's informal activities that are the thing. Other people are saying that formal activities are useful as well. And I sort of scratched my head about this a lot, and George did loads of work on it as well. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, most of the literature on activity theory does find some positive benefits of formal activity as well as informal activity on either friendships or the sense of well-being. And in particular, I dwelt on the work of Litwin and Shiovitz Ezra, because whereas when they were looking at an Israeli sample, they said it's the quality of the relationships that count, however they're made. When it came to their American sample, which was a pretty big sample, it was almost 1,500 people, they found the highest number of friends amongst those with friend-based networks. And those people happened to be the ones, the network type, that attended groups more frequently than the people with any other network type, despite the fact that the people with friend-focused networks had fewer close relatives than the family or the diverse types. So that suggested to me that it's group attendance that generates friendships, rather than those friendships simply being the outcome of informal contacts or family relationships. And I think this does have considerable implications for housing providers, because it means that, yes, organising the bingo is important, but it ought to be a bit more interesting than bingo. I said earlier that these various networks are a kind of recruiting ground for friendships. And I sort of wrapped my brains about, you know, how do people actually make friends? You know, you're in an activity, you go to a choir once a week. Well, how are you going to turn those people into friends if that's what you want? We actually, I think, know very little about the micro process of making friends. And it will be very interesting to research this in the context of older people, not just from the point of view of, what should I say, abstract social theory, much as I should have probably much more respect for that than as a habitual number cruncher I do. You know, I think the first thing I came across that was useful was this quote from Ritchie and Diaz. Successful aging depends on a selection of activities that enable the selection of social partners to provide blah, 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 blah. The second was the idea that it has to be meaningful activity, which contributes to the individual's sense of purpose and to maintenance of a sense of identity. And that also it's helpful if the activity participation involves the pursuit or achievement of personal goals, thus adding to a sense of personal mastery or accomplishment. And it was interesting, I came across, I think, at least 3 papers where people were saying that even the most frail people can participate in tasks which give them a sense of importance, meaning, mastery over something. The first was a paper which talked about people in a care home being asked to participate in an exercise where they evaluated the food that they were being given. And they fed that back to the management and they discussed it. And, you know, however old they were, however fragile they were, they could certainly do that. There was another exercise where some facilitator brought people together in telephone conversations about their health, you know, mutually supporting each other through health problems. And so they were able to engage in what was called health talk, which they found a positive experience and which gave them extra meaning and extra channels to friendship. What actually happened in a lot of the sheltered housing schemes I visited was gardening. The more active ones, if they were given the opportunity, could engage in gardening. They loved it. It gave people something to talk about. It gave them something interesting to look at, something to admire, to walk about, to smell, to feel, to pick. And this was a very positive activity, and they could also win prizes, which gave them a sense of achievement. Obviously, that is confined to some extent to those who are fit enough, but there was one sheltered housing scheme where I really admired the residence group. It was a very old, established, and very effective residence group. And one of the things they'd done was they went en masse to the town hall to demand a little grant so that they could get raised beds in their garden. And even the ones in wheelchairs who went to this lobby, all 17 of them, could participate in gardening once they had the raised beds that they could reach. Importance of intergenerational contacts I've referred to. I mean, often it's really important to bring in outside volunteers or possibly to open up a common room as a community centre for a wider age range and a wider range of, what should I say, non-dependent older people. And I should lastly mention charity fundraising. Charity fundraising was one of the most popular social activities. The estate managers often organised it, so did the social committees that the residents ran for themselves. And people loved it. It gave them a sense of achievement. It gave them a sense of feeling that they were participating in the community and doing something for the outside world. So that was something, again, that everyone could participate in. So information from the estate managers about what actually happens. Now, here we were trying to look, on the one hand, at the conversations we were having with people. What did they want and were they getting it? Secondly, at what the literature says are useful and meaningful interventions with this age group to alleviate loneliness and help people make friends. And so we were comparing, if you like, the sort of ideal desiderata with what actually happens. And although some social activities were reported on 80% of the 400-odd estates that these 326 estate managers, bless them, covered, some of them had more than one estate to deal with, some of them had 2 or 3. The typical range of activities was pretty narrow: coffee mornings, bingo, birthday parties, Christmas parties. Only just over half the estates had common rooms, although it has to be said that the estate managers were pretty ingenious in finding other spaces where things could happen if the residents wanted them. Some of them had garden parties in the summer, some of them organised knitting circles and the like in a foyer, some of them used empty flats that weren't being occupied. But the common room did make a difference. I mean, if we look at weekly activities as distinct from any activity, 70% of the estates with a common room had something going on at least once a week in it, whereas only 10% of the estates without common rooms had an activity as often as once a week. And what I really want to emphasise, this is coming to the conclusion now, is that the organisation of activities, and in particular the organisation of the more interesting activities, depended a great deal on the managers. There were just under a third of the estates where the managers were involved in organising at least one activity a week. Just over a third where there were weekly activities that were organised by the residents themselves without any input from the managers. But when it came to things like seaside outings, which people loved, or bringing in volunteers from a university to read to people, or volunteers to push wheelchairs about, or volunteers to help cater for a party or something like that, or to run reminiscence sessions or music or something, then it was the estate manager who tended to organise it. And it was the estate managers who tended to fix up contacts with the local voluntary service or with the local school to do a joint carol concert, or to have school children visit for a history lesson, which is a very popular activity where it happened. Managers are able to find people to give talks, exercise trainers, that kind of thing. The residence groups themselves are much more diffident and less imaginative and less well-resourced to bring in these precious outside contacts. And I think this is where it's really helpful for the managers to help beef up the residence groups, and maybe housing associations need to work on this. I mean, I did suggest to the professional network of these kinds of staff, EROSH, that they might like to write a handbook on how to encourage and support a residence group. Because if people have got a professional to do it for them, they tend to rely on that professional. These professionals don't have the time so much now to organise seaside trips, book a coach, get the bookings, all that kind of thing, to organise a theatre trip, buy the tickets, make the booking, get the transport, all that sort of stuff. They basically, some of them are doing a lot of work outside of their job description to do things like bringing in volunteers to do things. but others really just don't have the time. So it would be really good if residence groups could be networked, given resources and confidence to do that kind of stuff for themselves and to organise a much wider range of activities. On the other hand, they often collapse, either because of internal disputes, bit of kind of cliquey stuff, or because the leading members die or they become too frail to continue their role. So here we have a degree of problem about continuing residence groups. What would be the sort of optimal array of activities? I think a range of different forms of mental stimulation and physical exercise to suit various tastes. Book clubs, possibly, because reading is very popular according to the Postal Survey. Art and crafts activities, they were welcome. Music, computer use, educational classes, talks, discussions, all that kind of thing. Walking football, we've learnt a lot about in the Age UK setup. Obviously a very useful activity, particularly for men who often feel excluded by all these widows. And activities that will actually foster emotional support and informal contact. So if you want people to make friends, they've got to see each other repeatedly. They've got to see each other in a meaningful context that enables them to identify, yes, I like so-and-so, I can talk about things to her. I've talked to her for long enough to know that. So I'm going to have coffee with her now, etc. And they need to be able to make links with other age groups and with healthier people. So this is where I think the Camden model of opening up a sheltered housing scheme or adjacent day centre to the community as a whole in a certain age group is really helpful. I spoke a little bit earlier about the various barriers to creating a social scene or to participating in activities. I'd just like to talk a little bit finally about racism. I mean, there was one estate where there was a kind of white common room clique, and there were a few African people who felt excluded from this. One of them actually spoke to the estate manager afterwards, also African, and I had a long conversation with this woman on the phone to try to make it clear that I was really not on the side of this white clique at all. And I'd spent 3 years of my life working in Mozambique anyway, and I lived in Tottenham where, you know, you have about the most diverse community possible, and I'm very happy to have been there for the last 30 years. So after that she felt a lot better. She told me something very interesting, that at that focus group she had met a lady of Italian descent who expressed difficulty in getting her shopping from the supermarket because she was too frail anymore to carry bags and she couldn't afford a taxi. And she said, I'm glad to have met that lady. I will offer to do her shopping for her. So that was a very nice outcome of the focus group. Anyway, policy conclusions. Useful if housing association staff could do something rather like the sort of triage job that we've been talking about earlier today, but they would need training to do it. That is to profile potentially isolated people and find things for them to do, find the ways in which they can make the kind of friends who will give them that neighbourly support, which is really important. Perform some kind of brokerage role. I mean, where the staff are around a lot, I think they still do this. They probably could benefit from training in how to do it better, based on the experiences from the sort of things we've heard about today. But they actually need more time. And I think, you know, skipping to the last point on the page, the staff role is really important as a service to the community as a collective. It's about helping residents to form and sustain committees or associations. It's about publicising events. It's about brokering relationships within the estate community of 40 or 50 flats. It's about helping to secure outside contacts and resources for a good range of social activities. And it's very difficult for them to do this if their hours are cut and cut and cut. Now, what really worries me is that a lot of housing associations are now switching to what they call floating support, where those who need to be visited will get an individual service, and someone will come round and say, you know, are you all right today, Mrs. Smith? What do you need? Do you need more information? Do you need more social care, etc., etc.? Can I put you in touch with so-and-so? Yes, fine. But where's the service to the collective, to the community? I mean, these are people who need to be assisted as a group. to form a collective community of the kind which would be optimal in the setting. And, you know, it may be that activity organisers could complement this floating support, but the estate residents are very worried about the cutback in staff hours because they see that. I mean, this was brought out in that report that Age UK did a while ago called What's Listening. They're very worried about the cutback in sheltered housing managers' hours because they feel that something really important as a service to the community as a collective is being taken away. So we need to look at that. And I think the last question is, can a public health case be made for spending money on this, which is why some of the things we've heard today are so important. So I'll leave those comments with you for discussion. Thank you.